you asked a very, very, very chilling question
Yeah.
appropriately. What if there are mass roundups? What if federal agents come to workplaces in Evanston and start rounding people up? We're not in a position to engage in a military
Mm.
resistance of the federal government. I don't want to pretend that we have powers we don't have because I don't want to put people inappropriately at ease. But I do think that it's important to remember that the overwhelming majority of law enforcement personnel are local employees and to some extent state employees. And so the federal government will not be able to do what they're threatening to do without cooperation from local municipalities. And that's really
Hmm.
where we come in.
Welcome to another episode of Just the Facts with me, Jill Wine-Banks, the Watergate Girl. And today is the anniversary of January 6th, so I want to take a moment before we start the show to just say condolences to all who lost people on that day and hope for the future. It looks like today will go smoothly, but we cannot forget what happened on January 6th. We cannot ignore it. So, with that, let's move on. As you know, I've named the show Just the Facts, not just because that's what Sergeant Friday said, which is just the facts, ma'am, but because I think facts are the most important thing, that we need to make sure we get them out. So I have this show so that I can bring on people with knowledge and experience and facts to talk about important issues. And today, I'm very excited to be talking to my own mayor, Daniel Biss. He also was my former state senator and my former state representative. So he's represented me for a long time. And I want to talk to him about what local and state governments can do to protect all of us from what is coming in just 2 weeks from today with the inauguration of Donald Trump for the second time. Just so that you all know, Daniel Biss, who is my mayor, the mayor of Evanston, is actually a mathematician by education. And I didn't actually know this, Daniel, until I was preparing for today, that you actually have a master's and a PhD in mathematics, and that you were a professor at the University of Chicago. I found that astounding and wonderful. And those degrees are from Harvard and MIT. So they're a big deal. I also learned that you come from a very famous musical family, and I've always heard that there's a relationship between music and math. Did you go the math way because you didn't like music, or why didn't you go into music with the rest of your family?
Well, I've always been a little bit of a black sheep. There's no two ways about it. And you're right. My whole extended family, parents,
Yeah.
grandparents, brother, everybody, uncle, they're all professional musicians. And then you got me over here. I think there is some connection, and I saw it all the time as a mathematician because I was surrounded by people who were in math and
Right.
science and loved music. They would be amateur musicians. They'd go to concerts all the time. Of course, my parents don't have a lot of musician friends who are amateur mathematicians, so they're a little bit more baffled by the whole thing. But we make it work.
Okay. Well, I thought it was very interesting that you've done all of that before going into politics, and you're the perfect person to be talking to about this very serious threats that I think we're facing. And I just read, and I'm going to read you because I don't know if you've seen this, but I just read that you said, I think we're going to have to do things to protect Evanstonians against actions of the incoming administration. So that's what I want to do. And you specifically mentioned in those remarks that you were talking about how to protect immigrants and LGBTQ people. There are many other things you mentioned, but we'll start with those two. And I'm just wondering, do you have any specific plans to combat what we're worried about, mass roundups at workplaces, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, we are thinking about this all the time. In fact, I have a series of meetings later today with our team because we anticipate we have only one more city council meeting before the inauguration, and we
Mm.
would like to pass a strengthening of our welcoming ordinance so that on January 20th, when he takes the oath of office, we have in place the strongest possible protections for immigration. Because I do think while there's a lot that's up in the air, I think it's pretty clear that they're going to go after immigrants quickly.
Yeah.
That seems pretty apparent. Um, in 2017 when he was newly inaugurated the first time. The administration that preceded me put in place a welcoming ordinance, but
Hmm,
we've been working with the Illinois Coalition on Immigrant and Refugee Rights and the ACLU and other experts on these topics. And we just want to make sure that we're ready with every aspect of what needs to be done. So let me give you an example.
please.
We've passed policies about cooperation between Evanston Police Department personnel and federal immigration authorities. That's all in place. But what about data? What if Kash
Mm,
Patel's FBI calls up the Evanston Police Department and says, I want all the data that you have collected over the course of the last 20 years of doing business in Evanston about who may not have documentation, who may have family who doesn't have documentation. What protections can we put in place to make sure that we are not essentially co-opted by federal law
mm,
enforcement entities to become a part of something that's completely inconsistent with our values? So we're working not only with outside allies, but our own legal team to figure out how strong protections we can put in place so that we don't play a role in any of that. Now, obviously, you asked a very, very, very chilling question
yeah.
appropriately. What if there are mass roundups? What if federal agents come to workplaces in Evanston and start rounding people up? We're not in a position to engage in a military
Mm,
resistance of the federal government. And I don't want to pretend that we have powers we don't have because I don't want to put people inappropriately at ease. But I do think that it's important to remember that the overwhelming majority of law enforcement personnel are local employees and to some extent state employees. And so the federal government will not be able to do what they're threatening to do without cooperation from local municipalities. And that's really
hmm.
where we come in.
Well, I hope that this all happens. For those who aren't from Evanston or the Chicago area who would already know, Evanston is a particularly blue jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
Overwhelmingly voted for uh, Joe Biden, um, both both times, and has reparations that we have offered, has always had gun prohibitions. It's a very liberal community, I would say. And so that will make your job easier. Have you talked to other mayors to see if they are taking on similar um, planning to protect immigrants? And you also mentioned in that remarks that you were going to try to protect LGBTQ. Is there anything specific on that?
Yeah, I'm talking to other mayors all the time. You're exactly right, Jill. We are um, pretty politically unconstrained.
Yes.
The Kamala Harris, just like Joe Biden, got 91% of the vote here in
Yeah.
Evanston. So our residents really are essentially unanimous on this issue and want to see us doing what we can. I recognize not every mayor is in that
Yeah.
fortunate situation. So I'm talking both with mayors of communities that have similar politics to Evanston as we're thinking about how do we share best practices, how do we work together to push the envelope. I'm also talking with a more politically diverse group of mayors who represent a more politically diverse group of
Mm,
communities because there's clearly strength in numbers and there are going to be some places where we can have broader agreement. So, for example, not every mayor I talk to may see the same way I see immigration issues and LGBT issues, but there will be agreement on the need to protect federal revenues, right? So mayors across Illinois, whether they may be Republican, Trump supporting mayors, they'll still say, well, hold on, we shouldn't have an administration that engages in retribution against Illinois because it's a blue state
right.
and seeks to withhold federal funding that municipalities are using to do infrastructure investments, to do lead pipe replacement, which is complying with the state mandate. So I think there's both kind of how do you push the envelope with your kind of ideological partners, and then how do you build broad coalitions to make sure that we're advocating as broadly as possible, that mayors from communities that voted for Trump are standing up for their residents, that mayors from states that voted for Trump are standing up for their residents as well. With LGBT issues, part of it, I think it's important to say that we don't just live in a progressive city. We live in a blue state, that there's been unified Democratic control in Illinois since Governor Pritzker took office in 2019. And on some of these issues, I think Illinois has led the way in terms of protections for LGBTQ people, for trans youth. Um, and so I think part of it is making sure that we continue to work with our state partners and have strong legal protections there. I do think this is another issue where if you see some of the more alarming and dystopian outcomes come from
Mhm.
Washington that some might imagine, involving rounding up people or kind of engaging in kind of aggressive pursuit of LGBT youth or their parents. That's where the city's role in holding
Right.
our data becomes important, where we don't let them reach into the information we have as part of some kind of grotesque and nightmarish witch hunt. And so again, we're examining every possibility there. And like you said, Jill, we're lucky. Our residents want us to do this. So
Yeah.
the sky's the limit. Our question is, how much can we figure out to do that will allow us to protect our residents? And I think our council and our residents will be essentially unanimously in support of doing all of that.
Before I continue, I realize I made a very bad mistake in saying that we voted for Biden twice. We voted for Biden in 20. We voted for Kamala Harris by overwhelming majority in this election. So sorry, Vice President Harris, who will today be
Yeah.
confirming the election of Donald Trump, much as Richard Nixon as vice president did when he lost the election to Kennedy. So,
Well, and Al Gore.
oh, that's right. And Al Gore, who, well, question whether he actually lost or not,
It
but
is a
who did
question.
uh, have to confirm the election of his opponent.
And
That
if I could just interject
Sure.
here, Jill, I was so appreciative of the way you opened this discussion, just being clear about the fact that this is another January
Yeah.
6th, that we cannot forget what happened 4 years ago, that it's not going to happen today. But of course, it's not going to happen today because the Republicans won.
Yes.
And so you can't have a system where there's only a peaceful transfer of power when one side happens to win.
Yeah.
And, I think we just need to be clear about how enormously dangerous it is that what you and I grew up with, taking for
Yes.
granted the peaceful transfer of power as a result of the election outcomes that we can all agree on, is being threatened by one person, Donald Trump, and
Yeah.
one political party, the Republicans.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is become a widespread problem with over 70 million people actually believing the and misinformation that is being spewed by multiple sources,
Mm-hmm.
mostly coming from Donald Trump, but being perpetuated on Fox and OAN and TikTok and other sources. So it's a serious problem, which again is why I think a show like this is so important, is to talk about facts and to really let's talk about education actually next, and in terms of what can be done. I mean, you have a completely unqualified person nominated to be head of the Department of Education, with the pledge that they're, under Project 2025, going to eliminate the Department of Education, that they will control the curriculum, they will prevent teaching what I would consider to be fact-based history, to be teaching civics in a way that I think you and I grew up with. And so, is there something that Evanston is planning, or that you, in conjunction with other mayors, are planning to protect against book banning and curriculum modification?
Yeah, just to give one obnoxiously technical response, in Illinois, the schools are actually run by separately elected bodies. So
Yes.
they're not underneath the mayor, but obviously the schools are incredibly important in this community. So, I work with our school districts, and again, we are lucky. There is very, very strong alignment, not only with our schools, but with our libraries about not just the idea that book banning is bad, but the idea that we hire teachers and librarians because they have studied the question and they know better than you and me what children need to learn and thrive. And if we don't trust them, we are just
Yeah.
missing out on the opportunity to educate children properly. That's what Evanstonians want. That's what Evanston
Yeah.
school board members believe, and that's what Evanston schools are going to do. Now, you raise something really terrifying. Project 2025 proposes to eliminate the Department of Education. And one thing that every education expert I've talked to since Project 2025 was first published is kind of puzzled about is what does that mean about the revenue streams that public school
Mm.
districts in every neighborhood of this country have come to rely on. I think that really opens up a line of conversation that's truly pivotal here, which is this question of to what extent is this administration going to come for federal funding of things that, may over at the headquarters of the Heritage Foundation sound like, left wing or democratic priorities.
Mhm.
But if you actually go to any town in America, that's just the things people need, whether that's funding for schools, funding for hospitals through Medicaid. I'll give you an example. Uh, President-elect Trump, in the debate with Kamala Harris, famously explained that he has the concept of a plan to repeal the Affordable
Yes.
Care Act. I have no idea what he's really envisioning on that front.
Yeah.
Maybe he learned his lesson last time that he tried to repeal it and there was a huge backlash and he failed, but maybe not. Well, one thing that's a really important part of the Affordable Care Act is it expanded the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program
Hmm.
ordinarily splits the funding 50-50 between federal and state government. But because the Affordable Care Act was trying to get population covered that had not been covered before, they said, listen, we're going to pay for 90% and the states
Wow.
only have to pay for 10% of that population. And the point is not only is it the right thing to do and someone else is covering 90% of it, but actually that kept rural hospitals up and running. It kept employment in economically struggling communities going. It wound up more than paying for itself and the tax revenues
Yeah.
that resulted from people being at work. But when many states, including Illinois, passed the Medicaid expansion and said, yes, we'll take the 90% to cover millions of our
Right.
residents and we're willing to pay the 10%, there was political pushback, and people at the time said, well, what if that 90% decreases at some point? Well, Illinois, to respond to that criticism, said, okay, we'll cover the 10% right now under the current rules, but if the federal government ever walks away from their commitment to pay 90%, we're going to stop with the expansion. So in Illinois today, if the Affordable Care Act were to be repealed, there would be millions of people
Wow.
instantly without health insurance. And so this is another example, together with what happens if the
Yeah.
Department of Education is abolished and those federal funding streams are repealed, where local governments, state governments, nonprofits, and communities in blue states and red states, in rural and urban and suburban places alike, may be having to deal with very, very, very awful choices. And so part of what we're doing in Evanston is saying, what revenues are at risk? What funding from the federal government that we are currently relying on is at risk?
Yeah.
What do we do to protect it? Who do we partner with to make sure we're putting our best foot forward to stop it from being taken away? But if it's taken away, where can we find other funding and
Yeah.
what are our priorities? Because we may be presented with some pretty unbearable questions relatively soon.
And these are facts that people voting were not aware of, that
That's right.
they really didn't get. In the same way they didn't get what the immigration threats were. They
Yeah.
didn't think it meant them or their family, and voted for Donald Trump anyway. Have you found any partners or solutions to the potential risk to losing the Medicaid funding or housing grants? Or you mentioned climate and the
Yeah.
change of our piping. How are states and cities and villages and rural areas going to be able to fund that without the federal money? And how do I, as a citizen, feel about paying federal taxes that are being used not for the things that I believe we should be funding?
Yeah. I mean, that's, all those are great questions. I'm going to start with your last question. Um, the idea that we are paying taxes to the federal government to fund political
Right.
warfare against our communities is extraordinary. And I think people don't appreciate
Yeah.
how different this is. People are pretty cynical, right, Jill? People assume, oh, all these politicians are, they're politicking and they're engaging in retribution. But actually, if you look at how much money of the things like the infrastructure law that was passed under Biden went to Republican states, went to
Yes.
districts with Republican members of Congress, it's that's really not been about retribution. That's been about funding projects everywhere in the country where they were needed, regardless of the politics of the locality. And now we're talking about a potential situation where federal dollars are going to go to reward people who do what Donald Trump wants, and they're not going to go other places to punish people who don't do what Donald Trump wants. And that's a very, very, very scary thing. It threatens the cohesiveness of the country in really alarming ways. Now, there are some things that we're doing in Evanston that are very practical, right? So we were awarded a large, more than $10 million grant from the Department of Energy as a part of the Inflation Reduction Act, as part of our climate efforts here in Evanston. That's a lot of money for Evanston. That's important for us. Well, we're just working with the current administration. Remember, we have one president at a time, and his name is Joe Biden right now, to finalize that grant agreement to get everything locked down. And we're doing that with housing related funding as well, just to make sure that the funds that we're already expecting will be untouchable, essentially,
Mm,
by the new administration. Doesn't mean they won't try to touch it, but it means that we'll
yeah.
have a much stronger case in court than if we hadn't done that. Some of it is things you mentioned, lead pipe replacement. Lead pipe replacement is very important work from a public health standpoint. It's also legally required, mandated by the state of Illinois.
Right.
It's something the city of Evanston has to spend millions of dollars a year on, and we've been anticipating a lot of federal help for that. If we don't do that, if we don't get that, I should say, I think we're going to have to find the money to do it on our own, because if you allow lead pipes to deteriorate without replacing them, you wind up with a horrible public health crisis with neurotoxins that poison children's brains. It's not acceptable. We
Yeah.
can't live like that. But the burden on Evanston taxpayers, if we get none of that anticipated federal help, will be very, very tough. So part of it is just understanding what might be coming and trying to prepare. Part of it is making sure we lock down and protect the funding that we can protect before January 20th. And part of it is working with colleagues from across the country,
Mm,
because I think if a single mayor from a relatively small, extremely blue town in a blue state calls the Trump administration and say, protect my funding, that call may not get returned. But if 1,000 mayors from all 50 states representing all kinds of different communities join arms, I think our voice will be heard in a different way.
I hope so. And let me point out, I just saw a map that showed, while we are clearly a blue state in terms of history, it's because of the large population centers. If you look at the rest of the state, it's completely red. Um, it is Cook County, Chicago area, that is blue, and a few other little spots. But basically, we're a red. It's just that there's very low population because they're rural areas, and so it it's a fraught time. Even though, as you said, our state is both the House, the Senate, and the governor are Democrats, and have been
That's
for
a
a while.
That's a really important point, Jill. I mean, in fact, there's a group of unbelievably conservative, sort of MAGA
Yes.
style legislators from the eastern part of Illinois who continually try to secede from Illinois. It's one of those funny things where it's not legal, it's not going to
Yeah.
happen, it's silly, but also it would be the worst thing that had ever happened economically to that region. That would become instantly a very poor state.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are very conservative parts of Illinois. Rural Illinois has gotten redder and redder and redder.
Yeah.
Jim Edgar, who was the Republican governor from 1990 to 1998, loves to tell this story about how in 1994, when he was reelected in a landslide in that great Republican year, he won 101 of the 102 counties, and he always asks audiences, "What county do you think I lost as a Republican?" And everyone says Cook County, the county containing
Yeah.
Chicago, that now votes, probably 75-25 for Biden. But no, he won Cook County in 1994. He lost a small downstate county called Gallatin County along the Kentucky border. And so the politics have changed dramatically in
Yeah.
Illinois. There used to be rural Democrats and downstate Democrats, and now we're living in this time where things are so polarized that rural Illinois is just ruby, ruby, ruby red.
So I want to go back to one specific thing in education because I worry greatly about uh, the lack of civics training. And
Yeah.
I'm astounded when I hear um, people interviewed on the street by news reporters asking about various things in civics. How many branches of government? What's the just specific questions that I can't believe people don't know, and they don't understand the balance of power, the separation of power. And is Evanston one of the places that they're doing a lot in terms of civics training?
They do take it seriously and they do a nice job. So they've been a bulwark against that. And frankly, when I meet with kids, when I visit classes, and I do that all the time, my one scheduling rule is I never say no to students. I'm really impressed with how well educated and engaged they are on these issues. But as you say, it's very, very erratic across the country. There has been a huge backsliding, in the last few generations in the universality of civics education. And you said something else that I don't think we give credit to, which is that American government is kind of complicated, right? And American
Mm-hmm.
voters are assigned a lot of homework. When you go to vote, you have vote not only for president and Senate, but for water reclamation district commissioners and Cook County board members and community college board trustees. So and we have complex separation of powers, and so you can't just elect a president and assume that they're going to solve all your problems for you. And if you elect a president and they don't solve all your problems, you shouldn't necessarily be mad at them because maybe it's Congress's fault or the
Yeah,
judiciary. So in order to be a successful voter, you need some real education about how these systems work. And when
yeah.
we deprive people of that education, we have no right to act surprised that they're not equipped to vote in a way that winds up benefiting the country.
I wonder how many Americans, native-born Americans, would be able to pass the immigration test. I believe
Great
that
question.
immigrants may know more about our system of government than many people educated in America born here, because they have to pass that immigration test. And it would be an interesting thing to see. I don't know, maybe the New York Times could publish the immigration test and test yourself, see how you would do, because it is, as you've said, it's really important. And I think there are engaging ways. I don't know if you saw, President Biden wrote an op-ed talking about remembering January 6th and the importance of the peaceful transfer of power. And as I read it, I thought, there's a lot in here that could be a children's book with
Mm,
illustrations to get kids to understand the peaceful transfer of power and the role it plays in our democracy. Um, and I don't know, there's just something in me that wants to reach out to young children to teach them about these important things. Uh, you know, I think let's move to again, because of what happened over the new year. We have to talk about terrorism and
yeah,
domestic terrorism, because both of the people involved in these horrendous acts were American born, raised here, grew up here, um, and served in our military for a long time honorably. And how do you prepare for this kind of thing as a city, as a state? Um, Chicago, which is, Evanston is contiguous to and almost part of. We're served by the same transit system. When I go downtown, I'm taking the Chicago Transit Authority to get there. Um, and so I want to make sure that Chicago isn't unprepared. What
right,
is there anything we can do, both in terms of identifying people who are radicalized, um, or suffering from mental illness, or PTSD? How do we identify the risk without hurting fundamental freedoms,
right.
freedom of speech, freedom of action, all of those things? But how can you prepare without violating those rights? and protect the citizens of varying places.
Yeah, it's a very hard problem, and it's a this conversation I think is actually intimately connected to the rest of our conversation because part of the answer, just from a pure kind of resources and technical expertise level, has to be on the federal level in the Department of
Yeah.
Homeland Security and so forth. And it is troubling to say the least to imagine the federal government being politicized in the way it thinks about these issues. So that's really scary to me. We as a humble town of 75 or so thousand people, we already think hard about these questions. And I have to say, when the horrifying nightmare happened, at the beginning of New Year's Day in New Orleans, I instantly thought to the fact that we just in the last I forget when, but in the last year, we've worked with our police department to make a major purchase for barriers,
Mm.
specifically to secure and protect public events, um, and to make sure that we can block them off appropriately and entirely. So that specific thing is something we've actually given thought to. I don't want to say too much, but I can say that our, in our little town, our police department of 150 or so people gives serious thought to securing large public events, to lines of sight and egress and entry of large public events. Obviously, we can't do it all on our own. Our police department is in partnership with a variety of consortiums. We work with other law enforcement entities in the region and also with the state police. The state has an emergency management agency, the IEMA they call it, the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and
Hmm.
they're very professional and they do great work, as of course does Chicago is obviously a giant organization that has very, very significant professionalism. Um, so we prepare for all of these things. We think about eventualities. We're willing to invest financially in preparation, preparedness,
Hmm.
and safety. I don't think you can talk about this without talking about guns as well. The ready availability of guns in the hands of people for whom it is simply not safe for them to have guns is a tragedy in this country. And we in Evanston have done
Yes.
really everything we can think of, but we're not idiots. I mean, we understand that it's a small town and just across the border
Yeah.
is a whole different world. And so, I really applaud the steps the state of Illinois has taken on gun safety, though I know there's more to do. But it's the same thing. Indiana and Wisconsin are right
Right.
around the corner from Chicago.
Yeah.
And so the steps we take on the state level only matter so much. So I have
Yeah.
no illusions that we're going to do anything positive at the federal level on guns with Donald Trump in the White House. But I just couldn't let this question come up without talking about that component of the answer as well, because we're never going to fully get our arms around it with the gun problem being totally out of control the
Right.
way it is now.
And Evanston particularly has taken very strong action on this. But you're right. If you have Indiana on one side and Wisconsin on the other, and easy access there, it doesn't matter how much we restrict. And you know, there's no way that you can prevent people walking into events with guns, and they get past the magnetometers without a problem. And so it's, and particularly now with 3D printed guns, it's going to be even easier to get through. And it is a problem at the national level. You're right, unless we solve it nationally. And when we look at comparing ourselves to every other country, um, industrialized and otherwise, we have a problem in America that no one else has. And it's one that I personally don't understand. I do not understand. There's many things I don't understand about American policy. Um, uh, I just talked to someone who came back from Cuba. And again, I don't understand our policy about Cuba. I don't understand our policy on guns. I don't understand why anyone would want to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. But that's the country we live in. And I'm glad that I live in Evanston, where I can trust you and I can trust my neighbors. Um, I did see Trump signs this year for the first time. I saw a few, not many, But that's our democracy. I'm very proud that I have you and Jan Schakowsky at the federal level is an Evanstonian and a great representative. So I'm one of the lucky people in America that I have this, and I have you thinking about how to protect against. Before we close, I guess you mentioned Kash Patel, and so let's talk a little bit about that, because that is a serious threat. He is unqualified in terms of his experience to head the FBI, but particularly at a time, I couldn't help but think after the New Orleans and Las Vegas, that you want someone there who isn't looking for an enemies list and retribution and punishment. And uh, what can any of us locally do to impact? Is there anything about the cabinet that we can impact? We have several people. We've mentioned the Secretary of Education nominee, Kash Patel, the Attorney General, Bondi, Tulsi Gabbard.
Hegseth.
Those are, heck, oh, don't even get me started, because I served as General Counsel of the Army, and I know how big a fiscal management that is. And he's proved himself completely incapable at a small not-for-profit to manage money. So why would you put him in charge of that? I also know the value of women in combat. So why would you let someone who not just has been accused of sexual assault, but who opposes women in combat? So yeah, I mean, it's hard to say which ones are going to cause the biggest ruckus and whether any of them. I'm glad that it looks like FBI background checks are actually going to happen, even though Trump was saying he wasn't going to do it and that he wasn't going to even have a confirmation hearing. He was just going to do recess appointments. It looks like that may not happen. But is there anything, to be done, and who should we worry about the most?
Well, that last question is really something. It's so much to choose from. Um, I think about this all the time. You and I live in a state where I think it's always important to share your opinion with your senators, but I don't have a lot of
Yeah,
concern that Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth see
right,
this issue any differently than you and I
right.
do. Um, I mean, look, it's the same thing as always. There's a couple people from, Maine and Alaska who would certainly need to be a part of the opposition coalition, and then it gets a little harder, but you start asking about, McConnell or
Yeah,
some of the people who expressed concern about Gates. And I think it just becomes a question of, can people who live in those states, anybody who lives in those states, but especially people who are not seen as, kind of partisan Democrats, reach out to their senators and say, this concerns me. This is
right,
a problem. This is a danger to our country. Pick your example, whether, having somebody with Tulsi Gabbard's views and relationships on Russia and Syria is a threat uh,
right,
to our intelligence system, or whether having somebody with Hegseth's values and utter lack of qualification in charge of one of the most important and complex organizations in the history of the world is a threat to American security. Um, I think there are arguments that can be made that are not particularly partisan, that you don't need to be a progressive Democrat like me to find persuasive, but they're going to have to be made repeatedly in these states, because the amount of pressure, including pressure to their own personal safety, that Republicans get when they talk about
right.
standing up to Trump, even one iota, is remarkable. So I think we need to, I have felt a little bit since the election that people who were devastated by the election are just so upset that they're kind of retreating a little bit. And I understand the instinct, but I think now is the time to really speak out and speak up and create a groundswell, that at least gives some of the few Republican senators who might want to do the right thing kind of some of the space to actually do it.
I think if you live in a state represented by Republicans, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat and oppose these nominees or any of the policies that we've been talking about, it is up to you to write to your senator, Republican especially, to give them pause, to make them think about it. I also think that it's important for people to educate themselves on one issue. It's overwhelming if you think
Mm,
about all of these nominees and all of the issues. But if you pick one particular thing that you care about and learn enough about it so that you can be a good advocate on that issue, that would be an important contribution. So educate yourself, be prepared, write to your representatives, even those in blue states. We need to make sure that they feel the strength of our passion. And you're right. I mean, Tammy Duckworth is a combat veteran. She's certainly not going to be happy with Hegseth as a nominee. Dick Durbin has been reliable on everything. And so we don't have to worry here. But they could use our support too. I mean, it doesn't hurt to write to them, but I think it's up to everybody to make sure that this only lasts for 2 years. The Democratic Party must make serious efforts to make sure we win. That will start with who heads the DNC. It's more important when you don't have a president of that party that the DNC chair be a strong leader. I have a personal preference myself. Our neighbor to the north in Wisconsin, I think that Ben Wickler would be phenomenal. I think there are.
he's fabulous. He's
He is.
fabulous.
He spends money so well that you feel glad to give him money. But I do think that there are several other candidates who will do a good job too. He's my personal preference, but I think that we're in good shape in terms of who's going to lead the Democratic Party. I think messaging is important in the sense of not the values that are expressed, because the values are there. It's just making sure that people understand them, hear them in simplistic ways that are clear but can be understood. And that is important, and that we use the right channels to reach people.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we need to be focused on, so that in 2 years we don't have a we don't have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and that will be a guardrail. And we also need to focus on how important the courts are, and that right now we need to make sure that in 2 years we don't face an even bigger majority on the Supreme Court, that we have a power to prevent that from happening. So I think there's a lot for all of us to do, and I'm glad that you're taking it on behalf of the city of Evanston. And I look forward to seeing you around. Thank
Well,
you for
thank you
being
so
with us.
much. I appreciate it so much. It's really such an important conversation. So thanks for letting me be a part of it. And I would echo everything you just said, and I would just remind people who are feeling despair right now what the 2018 elections meant for our
Yes.
ability as a country to stop Trump from doing the worst things he was trying to do.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about how important the 2026 election is, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, we have a template for what it takes to put in place a Democratic majority that can put the brakes on this insanity. And we've
Thank you.
got to do it again.
And when we speak of elections in April, you're up for re-election. And so I want everyone on this show to watch this and see how great you are, so that they will support you in April.
Thank you so much, Jill.